Hi, and welcome back to my workshop. We're going to finish up on the Pensy station that we started in part 1 a couple months ago. If you remember, this was the Scale Agency office in Wayscales, Pennsylvania on the Pennsylvania Railroad. And these are all the images that I was able to collect to go by scratch building this. Now in part 1, I showed you how I had collected together all the materials and had the windows laser cut so they would match. And then I started assembling the building, and at the end of part 1 we had the basic sub-assemblies done. And this is where we left off. So now we're going to pick up at this point. I had cut some window shades out of manila stock to put in, and I weathered them using pan pastels so they'd look a little grimy. Then I used canopy glue to glue them in place. Next, I put a wall in the middle of both buildings. This was to act as a view block. And I created and printed out some background to put on the wall. I don't know if this was what it was like inside the station, but I thought it would look good looking through the bay windows. Next, I used my thin brown paint that I usually use to make the windows look dirty. Now I went ahead and painted the corner trim that was going to go on the main building. This was just made out of scale 1x3 strip wood. And I started on the roofs for the bays. This was going to take a lot of calculations. I first cut my pieces out of cardboard to make sure everything fit. Once I had the angles right, I cut it out of 1/32 aircraft plywood. And then I test fit all those and made sure they fit right. Once I was sure of that, I put some bracing underneath it to hold all the pieces in place and give an area to glue to. I glued all of those pieces in place and then went to the second bay and did the same thing. And that gave me my 2 roofs for the bay windows. I decided to go ahead and shingle the roofs at this point. I was using Railscale Models 3-tab shingles, and they went on very well, and I was happy with how they came out. Then I used some Monster Model Works siding for the floors inside the bays, and it matched the flooring of the interior of the building quite well. Now it was time to mount the windows into the bays, and it took a few different sizes of trim to trim out around the windows once they were put in place. But I cut the trim and painted it, and then after gluing the windows in place, I applied the trim as needed. Now I started on the foundation of this building. I was using 5/16 inch strip wood for this. In the photos, it's a pretty formidable concrete foundation, especially on the front of this building. So I first started by cutting my 45-degree angles on my saw and building the foundation for the small extension first. I first painted all of the pieces a gray. I ended up putting a second finish over it once it was attached. Then I started seeing how all of the pieces would fit onto the building. If I had to do any minor adjustments, I would use my Ultimation sander for that. I also had to attach the foundation to the bays as well. Now for the agent's bay, the foundation was exposed, but for some reason the scale house bay, it was covered in siding according to the photographs. Now it was time to work on a little bit of furniture. You'd be able to see in those bay windows pretty well. I got some desks and chairs from narrow gauge modeling, and after doing some finishing on them, I laid them out on some tape along with some filing cabinets that I had gotten from a friend. I first put a coat of primer on all of these pieces. Then I went ahead and spray painted them with Krylon Camouflage Brown. I had some detail pieces that I had also gotten, and I hand painted these. I started putting some pieces in place to see how they would look through the windows. I had made a cupboard for the balance beam in the scale portion. And then one thing I like to do is make blotters for my desks. I'll take a piece of masking tape and paint it green, and then cut them out into the right shape. and just stick them onto the desks. I put a little black paint on the corners and they look like blotters. So these are all the pieces that were going to go into it. And I glued those pieces in place. But I had also come across another desk that I wanted to put in there. This was a roll-top desk from Interaction Hobbies. I really liked this desk and enjoyed building it. And I wanted it to have a prominent place inside the scale house. This was putting together the chair. I used a little pastel on the cushion. And this is how this desk came out. So these were putting all the pieces in place and seeing how they look. Then I had all of my furniture glued in place on the inside of the structure. Now for the roofing of the main structure, I used scribe siding with the scribes facing down to look like boards. I painted these with the same brown, and then I started applying the shingles. Now in order to draw the lines and get the shingles straight, I used a divider that I had set to the right spacing. Then I go down both ends of the roofing, and these give me the points, and I draw my pencil line across it, and this gives me the lines to set the shingles to. Then after they were in place, I used a little bit of sandpaper to roughen them up. I glued both of them in place on the short extension. Then I applied the ridge cap on top. And I shingled the roofs for the main building, but I couldn't glue them in place yet. So this was a different finish that I applied to the foundation. I think after weathering it, it came out looking better than the gray that I had painted it before. I now started on the steps and platforms that led to the building. There were 3 of them, and I put 2 of them together now. The small one that goes to the extension building, and then the large platform that's on the front of the main building. I put these 2 together, but didn't want to glue them in place yet. I had drawn a design for the chimney for a friend of mine to 3D print it. He printed it in a number of pieces, and I glued in place some styrene channel to hold them in alignment once all the pieces were glued together. Now in the photos it looked like the bottom portion of the chimney was covered in concrete, so I painted that to match the foundation. Then I painted the upper portion a brick color, and I used a distress crayon to put the mortar in place. Then I was able to cut a hole in the roof and was able to glue both the chimney and the rest of the roof pieces in place on the main building. And I added a plumbing vent and sealed around it. Now I started working on the last set of steps and platform. These were going on the end of the building. And this had a lot more pieces to it, so I had to use my Ultimation slicer in order to get all the pieces I needed. I ended up using 020 wire to hold all of the posts in place. This would make it stronger than if I had just glued them. Then after they were in place, I was able to add my railings. And then this platform was done. Now they had snowbirds on the extension of the building, so I had gotten some from Tishy. And after painting them, I was trying to find how to put them so they were evenly spaced. I ended up marking it out on masking tape and putting the masking tape in place. And this allowed me to glue each one so they were properly spaced across the roof. Then I came back and added some rust running down from them. Now there was also a light that went over the front door, and I got metal castings from narrow gauge modeling. I ended up doing some cleaning up on them. They had a lot of flash, but after successive sandings it came out very nice. And then I went ahead and glued it together using super glue, and I painted the fixture a medium gray with the white reflector on the inside. Now the picture shows some type of electrical box underneath where the wires attach to the building. So I made a box out of some different sizes of wood that looked somewhat like it does in the photos. I went ahead and put some hinges on this box, and after staining it, I mounted it in place, and I ran some conduit up to where the attachments would be for the insulators. This shows the box and the lamp in place. Now, they also had close clearance signs on the track that went by the front of the two bays. So I made some of these and put them in place. When I came back, I had found some insulators on eBay, and I added those to where it looked like wires were attached in the photos. I'll come back and run some wire from the insulators to the conduit. I also had my friend 3D print some gutters. They were pretty prominent in some of the photos, so I ended up painting them and then attaching them to the front of the roof. I started with the small addition. I use a mixture of super glue and Walther's goo. This makes for a very strong attachment. Then I did the same, gluing the gutters onto the main building. Then I dry brushed some gray on it to make it look galvanized, and I went back over it with a couple different rust washes. The effect it had came out looking pretty good, I think. And I did this on all of the gutters that were attached to the front of the building. It had no gutters on the back. Then I started on the downspouts. I used 3/32 styrene tubing for this, and I had to cut it and attach them at the angles that looked appropriate based on all the photos. And then I'd also go ahead and sand it at the top so it would be a nice fit against the gutters. The first one was easy, and I decided that I was going to use part of hinges as attachment points so that it would show what they were attached to the building with. For the second gutter, it was a little more difficult because in the photos it showed a number of different angles. This would run from the main gutter down to the gutter on the scale house. Then once I had what I thought would work, I tacked it in place to see how it looked. Then I went ahead and painted all of them a silver color, and I started to glue them in place, using the little cut hinges as brackets. At this point, I was ready to glue the extension building onto the main building, and I did this on a slab of marble to have a perfectly flat surface. And after gluing and clamping, I let it dry. Now I was able to glue the rest of the downspouts in place, and I came back and put a little bit of algae where they would let out. Now in some of the photos you can tell that there are cellar doors on the side of the building. So I went ahead and constructed something that would look like cellar doors. And once they were put together, I went ahead and painted them to match the structure. And I'll end up putting some hinges on them and gluing this in place. And now I glued the bays onto the main structure. And then I started doing all the weathering to the entire building. I like to use artist pigments for this. I like the control they give me and all the different shades and textures that I can get out of them. I also used gallery glass to seal around the chimney where it went through the roof. At this point I glued all of the steps and the platforms onto the building. All I had left to do now was a couple little details. I was putting hinges on the cellar doors. For these I used Grant line. I bent them and glued them in place after painting them, and then weathered them with a little rust. And last, I wanted to attach some wires onto the insulators that were on the building, and I fed them into a box that would lead down into the conduit. This was one of the larger scratch builds that I've done, and especially given the limited amount of information that we had for this building. but I'm sure it's going to look great on the layout once it's put in place, and I can't wait to see it there. I want to thank you for letting me share this with you, and I hope you come back often to see more videos.